Whether it's a hot time in Florida or a rainy night in Georgia,
looking for trouble?
It's the perfect time for the TCBcast, an unofficial Elvis fan podcast.
Oh, yes, sir. Good to see you go, folks. We're just glad to bring you the hottest thing in the country, real hot and blue, coming to WHBQ in Memphis, Tennessee.
Before we get too much further, you and I have been working on sort of a long-form version of the main topic that we're going to do today for quite some time. And we have had the realization, aside from our scheduling stuff in terms of obviously work coming up and things like that, but we've also just realized there's a lot more research we got to do.
Oh, yeah. This is what he's alluding to, obviously, is that we're going to do a series about Memphis music, which is one of my areas of passion.
Yes.
And the problem is there's so much story to tell that we decided, let's get out kind of a quick, a Memphis music primer right now.
Yes.
And if you guys are interested, we can get much, much more in the weeds about this sometime in the future.
Yeah, so folks, please let us know if you end up enjoying this episode. And because of the length of this, we're not going to do a song of the week. However, John, you've prepared a playlist that we have included the link to in the episode description. This is a Spotify playlist, and it will include almost all of the songs that we're going to be talking about today, walking us through a very condensed version of Memphis's music history. Now, since we were just talking about the Memphis box set and the fact that Robert Gordon, who's an author who has written several books on the history of Memphis music, did the liner notes for that, what would you say are some of the best resources for folks who want to learn more about Memphis's music history before we even get started?
Ooh, there are so many good books out there, but a few that I have to highlight are a book called Beale Street Dynasty by Preston Lauterbach. It is a fantastic look at sort of the origins of Beale Street, which is so important to Memphis' story. I would also add Soulsville, USA by Rob Bowman, which is a history of Stax that is fantastic. And The Memphis Boys by Robin Jones, which is one of my favorite volumes about Memphis music.
So good. I just recently finished that book. It's so good.
Yeah, there's so many more, but those three are a few that I just have to highlight. And also, I will say Colin Escott and Martin Hawkins' Good Rockin' Tonight is a very good history of Sun Records as well as the Goralnik, Sam Phillips bio. There's a ton of great writing on Memphis music out there.
Yeah. Sam Phillips, the man who invented rock and roll, how one man discovered Howlin' Wolf, Ike Turner, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, and Elvis Presley, and how his tiny label Sun Records of Memphis revolutionized the world by Peter Goralnik. It's the full and proper official title of that book.
Absolutely.
Oh, Peter. And since we mentioned Robert Gordon, it's worth mentioning his books, It Came From Memphis, Respect Yourself, Stax Records and the Soul Explosion, and Memphis Rent Party as a few examples of some of the work that he's done. And since you also mentioned Preston Lauterbach in there, I do need to acknowledge and give a shout out to Preston, who has actually reached out to TCBcast directly and sent us an advance copy of his forthcoming book. It's called Before Elvis, The African-American Musicians Who Made the King. That is coming out in January of 2025, and tentatively, Preston may be coming on TCBcast to discuss the book at some point before the book's release. So, thank you, Preston, for sending that along, and definitely would recommend Beale Street Dynasty, which Preston actually also sent me a copy of, which was very, very kind of him. So, Memphis history. So, it will surprise people. We're actually going to not maybe talk as much about Elvis. We're obviously going to talk a lot about Elvis, but we're looking at, if people are picking up this Memphis set, what are they not getting out of this? That, yes, if they are reading Robert's essay, they might get some of this in terms of the history, but they're obviously not getting music. So you came up with a playlist of, how many did we come up with? 24 songs-ish?
Yeah, it's the 23. We couldn't quite find a 24th because it wasn't on Spotify.
Right. So 23 songs, and one that you can find out there on YouTube that hasn't been officially released on Spotify. Songs from other artists that sort of walk us through a story of Memphis's music history, a very abbreviated shortcut version, Cliff Notes version of it, to give some context of where Elvis came in and how Elvis was shaped by the Memphis music scene and how he shaped the Memphis music scene. So, John, treat me like I'm a Memphis moron and tell me early Memphis,
Yes,
the early history of the music industry in Memphis. Because obviously, like we've talked about, like Garrett and I covered Nashville on the other side of the state and country music. What's going on the west side of the state?
All right. So to start with, I'm going to give a little bit of context about the sort of things that shaped Memphis into what it is in U.S. history, right? So Memphis had a really unique role in the sort of drama of America that was playing out all around it. And this goes back all the way to the Civil War. As you guys know, in the 1860s, there was an American Civil War that was fought between the North and the South over the question of whether or not people could own slaves, right? And Memphis, because it was in the South, it was in Tennessee, was initially part of the Confederacy, which was fighting for slavery. But it was very quickly overtaken by the Union forces, which were anti-slavery. And because of that, it kind of like there are both progressive and regressive sympathies in Memphis that never really go away. Like you've got the sons of these Confederates, and you've got a lot of the more racially progressive white people that moved down there. But also you've got this really large population of African-American citizens that came to Memphis after it was overtaken by the Union, specifically because it was a haven, right, for runaway slaves. If you could escape the South and make it to Memphis, you could get your freedom. And a lot of these former slaves did escape to Memphis and joined the Union Army and helped secure freedom for like really the rest of the population down there. And so over the course of the Civil War, the black population of Memphis gets considerable. It's big enough that like for the next 100 years, you have a lot of these sort of segregationists, you have this white power structure that's sort of trying to hold down the black population and institute some of the Jim Crow laws and things that were going on in other parts of the South, but they're never really able to do it as much as they were in other places. Their control is imperfect just because they are so outnumbered by the African American population in the city. And so because of this, you had a really interesting situation develop. Right after the Civil War, there was a guy named Robert Church, and you can read about this in Preston's book, Beale Street Dynasty. He was the son of a white steamboat captain and a former slave, and he was himself born into slavery. So I guess actually it was a current slave at the time. Anyway, but he was born into slavery, and he was a biracial guy. And there was really no reason for him to think that he could make anything out of himself, but the guy was just determined to do it, you know? So he buys a saloon on what would become Beale Street and turns it into a really successful business. And he uses that money to sort of grow this little empire around where the saloon was. And it's the area of Beale Street and a lot of downtown Memphis. He eventually owns like all that area, and he very consciously uses his wealth. He was the South's first black millionaire. He very consciously uses that wealth to build a business and entertainment center for Black America. Right? He wants them to have political power, and he wants them to have business power. And what really sets Memphis off as a music city was, first of all, having all the facilities built by Robert Church and then his son, Robert Church Jr. They had auditoriums, they had parks that were really popular spots for musicians. But he was also very much a patron of African American citizens that he thought had a lot of promise. And in 1914, Memphis gets visited by a young man from Florence, Alabama, which will take a big role in this story as we go forward, named W.C. Handy. And W.C. Handy was a band leader from Alabama, and he sort of went to school to be a musician. He starts playing around Mississippi, and he played like sort of John Philip Sousa march style stuff at first. But at one of his gigs, he was asked by a woman in the audience, can you play some of our music, our traditional music, meaning like the blues?
Right.
And they didn't know any of the songs, so they let a local band play some of their instruments. And that was sort of his introduction to the blues. And he thought, wow, people really go for this. So he starts to sort of learn about the blues, which is, the form that has grown up from slave haulers. It's very much a part of the oral tradition of the African American community. And he finds a way to sort of work the forms of the blues into the style of music that he had learned, which is based in the sort of more European, like, the world of composition and notation and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's a blending of white and black music.
Exactly. And so when he basically puts what is traditionally black music into a form that is understood by white musicians at the time and publishes the first blues sheet music in 1912, it was like lighting a match and throwing it into a swimming pool full of kerosene. Like, it just caught the music industry by storm, and everybody was interested in the blues after that. And so the blues became something that was of great interest to people who were into music publishing. And eventually, when the phonograph record was started, it was also a subject of interest for the companies making records. So after Handy, like, Memphis became known as a center for the blues. And all of these musicians from, let's say, a 100-mile radius around Memphis, if they were talented musicians, they knew they could go to Beale Street. They could maybe be heard by people. And so there was a park close to Beale that was like the local meeting spot for musicians. And you could go out there, you could play your guitar, the people could come by and, like, give you a little bit of money. You might get hired to play dances or vaudeville shows that were traveling around out of Memphis. So Memphis became, after Handy, the center for black music in the South. And what reinforced that, because initially you also had some white musicians that would come to the city to play like country music, hillbilly. And Memphis was a big city. Like, you could find an audience for a little bit of anything. Eventually, the Grand Ole Opry starts in Nashville, so that sort of draws all of the white talent from the area towards Nashville, where the black talent comes towards Memphis, and it becomes this hub of the blues.
So obviously, like me coming in on more of the country history side of things, with the Grand Ole Opry, like that kind of starts in the era of like the 20s, you know, and that's when radio was really kicking off for a lot of these rural areas. The first radio station in Memphis, correct me if I'm wrong, was 1921 is when the first Memphis radio station, not in terms of like what race or anything, but just period, the first radio station, I think was WKN is what I was reading.
Yes, that's right.
When was the first station that would have played African-American programming? When did that go on the air?
Well, it depends. The first fully African-American station would be WDIA, and I think that went on the air in like 1948.
Right.
Yeah, so it was quite a while.
Yeah. So a lot of those musicians, blues musicians, wouldn't necessarily have had an outlet in terms of radio play.
Right. It would have been live performance.
But so primarily would have been live performance. And then in terms of the recording industry, to have records pressed and to actually make records, they would have had to have gone primarily to other cities that had that infrastructure.
Yes, there was no record production done in the city of Memphis really until the 50s. Now, that brings me, that's a nice setup for where I was about to go.
That's what I do.
The first time that records were made in the city, however, was in the late 20s, starting in 1927. Back then, they used to send these things called field units out into southern cities looking for what they called race records, which were records by black artists, and hillbilly records. And so what they would do is they would go and find a location where they could record, and they would set up a mobile recorder, which usually consisted of like a microphone or two and a disc cutter. So it was cut direct to disc, no tape, anything like that. And they would book acts in the area that they thought people might be interested in buying a record on.
Very similar to like what was done in Bristol, you know, with the with the country musicians. You know, it was effectively, you know, you had race and hillbilly were the terms at the time of the two different sort of prongs of that. But it was effectively doing the same thing. It was like, come ye rural folk to this one spot where there's going to be like a guy running the stuff for us to put this on record.
Exactly. And as a matter of fact, the Memphis sessions and the Bristol sessions were done by the same guy. The first, his name's Ralph Peer. Yep. He worked for the Victor Corporation. And he is, I think, in very many ways, a spiritual predecessor to Sam Phillips. One of the things that he would do is he would go into town and he would go to the local music shops, the places that sold instruments, and ask the people if they knew of any musicians that would come in to buy guitars or strings or have something repaired, like who was good, you know, who was worth listening to. And that was sort of how he developed leads to find people to record. And so this very first recording on the list is a recording of John Henry, the Steel Driving Man, by Furry Lewis, he's kind of known as a country blues guy. He was a Memphis blues guy. And one of the things that you'll notice about Memphis blues, as opposed to stuff that happened maybe further, deeper in the Delta, is that it's always kind of a hybrid of styles. It's not like, say, Robert Johnson, who's very much prototypical blues. With Furry, it's almost like a folk song. There's a lot of country in here. Furry was very famously a big fan of Jimmy Rogers. As a matter of fact, there's a recording of Furry in the, I think, 60s, where he performs Waiting for a Train, knows it note for note, word for word, all these years later, because, Jimmy Rogers was a big influence on him.
hobo. I want you all to understand and try to listen. The hobo was dying, and here where it went. I was all around water tank, waiting for a train. Thousands of miles away from home, I was sleeping in the rain. I walked up to a brakesman for to give him a line of talk. Furry, you got money, I see that you don't walk.
And this particular song I included because I think Furry's version of John Henry is the most direct antecedent of Johnny Cash's version that eventually came out.
That iconic version. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So that's the reason I picked this first track.
Section foreman said, "Hey, hammer swinger, I see you brought your own hammer, boy, but what else can all them muscles do?" And he said, "I can turn a jack, I can lay a trap, I can pick and shovel too."
Can you swing a hammer, boy?
Yes, sir, I'll do anything you hire me to.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I had never heard this version before, but I really, really love this. And, you know, this is one thing that, you know, in, all of my research on the country side of things, you know, it just kept popping up, this whole idea that early on, you know, there were a lot of records that were coming out that were very difficult for record stores themselves to classify. That was why there was, you know, such a push for, you know, trying to segregate out those genres and give them names that told you whether the person was actually, you know, supposed to be a white person or a black person, you know, or a person of color.
Exactly.
Because something like this, like, yeah, it kind of straddles some lines.
Yeah, very much so. Furry, like, one of the interesting things about this is, like, you know, when I was a kid and I was first discovering a lot of these early blues records, these things sounded ancient to me, right? When I first heard Robert Johnson, I thought, man, this must have been forever ago. Well, this Furry Lewis recording is 10 years before Robert Johnson. And Furry was still alive in 1969 when Elvis was coming back to do the American sessions.
Yep.
This is a very short window of time, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And so this other recording that you've got on the list next is from, I believe, around the same time, from another act that actually popped up in the country series, the Memphis Jug Band.
Yes, I love the Memphis Jug Band. The Memphis Jug Band, I think, are the major artists of the early era of recorded Memphis music that was done by Ralph Peer. Basically, the two main guys in the Memphis Jug Band are a guy named Will Shade and a guy named Charlie Burse. And the rest of the lineup are sort of like whoever was hanging around that day that they liked and thought could play. And so their songs are so diverse and they're crafted with such an ear toward like what I think of as pop music, and that they always have catchy hooks, and they can often be kind of sing-songy and they get stuck in your head, you know?
Yeah.
And so this one is called Cocaine Habit Blues, which is about...
it's about exactly what you think it is.
If you don't believe cocaine is good, there's Alma Rose and New York Woods. Hey, hey, gonna take a whiff on me. I love my whiskey and I love my gin, but the way I love my coke is a doggone sin. Hey, hey, honey, take a whiff on me.
Exactly. They just like their cocaine a little too much. And it mentions stuff like Mr. Lehman's, which was a drugstore in Memphis, and it mentions an area of town called Minglewood, which tells me that, like, even though this is often credited as traditional, this was written by the Memphis Jug Band. Like, it's too specific to them not to have been.
No, this was a ton of fun. I loved getting to hear this. I had included on the playlist for the country series their version of "He's in the Jailhouse Now," which they were they had covered at one point, and this is so much more fun even than that, because they're making, it's such a human thing too, of like, let's just make fun music out of like a real vice. And
it's like, how do you classify this? Is this really blues? Because it's kind of blues, but it's kind of country, and it's kind of like vaudeville.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, like you were saying, it's very difficult to classify.
And remember, folks, that like a lot of the jug band music ends up becoming an influence when you get around to the 50s and 60s to Lonnie Donegan in the UK and skiffle music and stuff like that. The roots of it are here in Memphis in the 20s.
And I'll point out something interesting about this, which if we do a more in-depth episode, we can talk about this at greater length. But one of the guys who gave an interview in the 70s that talked about helping Elvis get into some of the clubs on Beale Street was a guy named Robert Henry, who owned a shoe shine parlor / record store on Beale Street in the 50s. But back in the 30s, he was the manager of the Memphis Jug Band. And according to him, one of the guys that Elvis liked to go watch was a guy named Charlie Burse, who was one of the original members
of the Memphis Jug Band.
The Memphis Jug Band. So this would have still been in the air in Memphis, even in Elvis's day.
Wow. And then this last one that you've included. Now, this one, I believe, was recorded in Chicago, but she's from Memphis, and she literally has Memphis in her nickname.
Yes.
Memphis Minnie, Me and My Chauffeur Blues.
Wants to see my chauffeur. Wants to see my chauffeur. I want him to drive me. I want him to drive me downtown. Says he drives so easy, I can't turn him down.
This is so good.
Yeah, this is a great song. So the reason that I included this is so Memphis was a real center for recording there in the late 20s and early 30s. When the Depression hit, it really decimated the industry, and they started cutting back on things that they considered inessential, and race records were one of the first departments that they cut out. So guys like the Memphis Jug Band, Will Shade did very well with his records for the Memphis Jug Band. He bought a house off of them. He got like $3,000 in 1929 money of RCA stock.
Holy crap.
Yeah, and he lost it all during the Depression, right? Which is really sad. But afterward, they still recorded what they called race records. They still recorded blues. But instead of sending the field units out to Memphis, which was not seen as economically viable, they would take the most popular artists and either put them on a train to Chicago or New York, and they would make their records there. So from the late 30s to the early 50s, the only glimpses we get of what Memphis music would sound like were these artists that went outside the city to record. And Memphis Minnie is one of the greats of this era. Her real name was Lizzie Douglas, and she was a hell of a guitar player. She's kind of like the Mother Maybelle of the blues.
Yeah.
And she got married to a guy named Kansas Joe McCoy, and this is the two of them recording in Chicago for the one and only Lester Melrose.
Which is a name that should be familiar by this point to TCBcast listeners. Lester Melrose, who ripped Arthur Crudup off.
And so many other people, too. Yeah. So, yeah, this is it's a great sort of blues shuffle. I think you can hear the blues moving toward rock and roll, even here in the early 40s.
Oh, yeah. And this is such a, when you think about classic, iconic rock and roll songs, they're about cars, they're about, Stuff like that. You know, you think of a classic like Chuck Berry, No Particular Place to Go, or Maybelline, or things like
or
that.
Rocket 88.
Rocket 88, yeah. And, you know, the lyrics are about this gal wanting, you know, the chauffeur that she's sweet on to drive her around. You know, she calls him the chauffeur. But if he drives around other girls, then she's literally going to shoot him.
Yeah, exactly.
But as long as he's good, though, she's going to keep him in the money. She's going to buy him a new V8 Ford.
And Memphis Minnie was famous for being an amazing guitarist, and that's on display in this track.
That guitar solo is so good.
Oh, yeah. And she was a big influence also, it's worth mentioning, on Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who also would become an amazing female guitarist.
So she's before Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Just barely. Minnie's first records were made in like 34, 35, and I think Sister Rosetta started in like 39.
Contemporary, early contemporary.
Yeah.
Well, I must buy him. Well, I must buy him a brand new V8, a brand new V8 phone. And he won't need no passengers. I will be hello. Yeah, take it away.
So basically, after World War II, the industry really changed. And like every time the budget would constrict, like the people who got screwed over were usually black artists, you know? Mm-hmm. And so there was rationing on shellac during World War II, which caused the major labels like RCA and their Bluebird subsidiary that recorded mostly blues music, they couldn't press as many records, which meant that they kind of got rid of their blues records divisions, you know? They made less of those. And what that meant was that opened the industry up to independent record labels, right? And since Memphis had been such a hotbed of talent, specifically black talent, it was obviously of interest, once again, to these independent record labels who were trying to make records for the blues and R&B markets. And you had a few attempts at a record label in Memphis before Sam Phillips, but Sam and Son were really the first ones that worked. And in 1949, Sam opened Sun Records with the idea that he's going to record masters at a studio and then lease them to these independent record labels that have been serving the R&B market, right? Mm-hmm. So he works with Chess Records in Chicago. Yep. And he works with a group called RPM Records that was run by a couple of brothers called the Bahari Brothers. And they also later started Modern Records that did and Meteor that did rockabilly stuff like that. But at this point, Sam is focused on recording records for other people. And he's also interested in all this music that's on Beale Street. You know, Sam also, want to point out, comes from Florence, Alabama, just like W.C. Handy. And he hears the music of Beale Street, and he gets just sort of knocked off of his feet by it. He loves it. And these labels that had tried to record some of these artists before Sam came around hadn't really done the artist justice, he felt. Like a couple of Memphis artists like Joe Hill Lewis and B.B. King had been recorded by record labels in Nashville. And the engineers up there would have them sort of turn down their guitars, and they would space out the musicians so they're very far apart from each other so that the levels would not peak, right?
Right.
And they could get a nice, clean, articulate recording. Well, especially in the instance of Joe Hill Lewis, who was a one-man band, this just sort of took the spirit out of his records. It wasn't what he was supposed to sound like. So Sam, when he starts making records for other people, he spends the first few months, or maybe the first year of Sun Records or Memphis Recording Service, he's experimenting with different ways to capture what these guys sound like live, to get all of the excitement and all of the energy and all of that wild, untamed feeling they bring to their music on a piece of wax so that everybody could enjoy it the way that it's supposed to be heard, right? And She's Dynamite that I've got on here is a B.B. King record that was made for the Beharry Brothers. And you can tell that Sam has cracked the code. This is one of the most electric sounding records you'll ever hear. And he's backed up by the newborns, Phineas and Calvin.
Yep.
And their father. And man, they're a hell of a band. And this would have been the lineup that Elvis would have heard when he first went to see B.B. King. And one of the interesting things about B.B. is that in addition to being an early recording artist, he also had a spot on WDIA. So that, like, you get this sort of web of music that develops between the live performances and the recording studios and the radio stations, where you have a community that sort of flows between these points, you know?
Yeah, because there are only so many gateways into the entertainment industry, you know, and the professional, like, paying entertainment industry in Memphis, you know. So the real gateways are you're either going on the radio or you're going to, you know, somewhere like Sun Records to get cut for one of these other labels. Exactly.
You know? So one of the things that develops is after Sam starts recording these guys that had been on the radio, there's a guy named David Mattis who worked at WDIA. He was one of the white station managers. And he said, hey, why don't we just make our own record label, you know? So he made Duke Records, and he recorded a guy named Johnny Ace, who was a piano player and a really smooth singer.
I can hear Gurdeep Ladar's, like signal going off. You just said the magic word Johnny Ace.
Oh, Johnny Ace was fantastic. And he was one of the early artists who kind of captured this style that crossed over with white audiences.
Yeah.
Because it is R&B inflected, but it's also very pop. It's very smooth, very romantic. And they recorded a song called My Song, which was Johnny Ace's first big hit.
Told me that you would leave me here in tears, but now you're gone and hours seem like years. So darling, I sing my song.
And he puts it out on Duke Records, and he realizes that he doesn't know anything about running a record label, you know? And so he decides, I've got to ask somebody who's in the business, right? And I guess he either didn't know about Sam or he didn't want to talk to Sam because he considered him direct competition. So he went to go talk to the guy who was like the kingpin of R&B in the southwest of the country at the time, which was Don Roby, who ran Peacock Records out of Houston, Texas.
Yeah. So, and Peacock listeners should be familiar with Peacock because that is where Willie Mae Thornton had cut Hound Dog.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, been snooping around my door. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, been snooping around my door. You can wag your tail, but I ain't gonna feed you no more.
Yes.
Yeah.
In 52, yeah.
In 52, and so like Roby is having genuine hits, and so he is like the guy, potential go-to. It's like bringing in, the superstar athlete, of the business, to help this fledgling label that has got a few acts that are like, now starting to pick up steam, like Johnny Ace, and I think, let's see who else ends up being on Duke. Like, I think Bobby Blue Bland does some on Duke.
Bobby Blue Bland went to Duke. Junior Parker went to Duke. A lot of these guys, Roscoe Gordon went to the Harry Brothers to Modern, but a lot of these guys from Memphis wound up recording on Duke Records because of this deal. You see, like after Don Roby got involved to help Duke, he wound up taking over the whole label, which is quite an interesting story. According to David Mattis, he actually held him at gunpoint and forced him to sign a contract where he would give him Duke Records for $10,000. Don't know if that's true, but that's a story, and it's consistent with what a lot of other people say about Don Roby, so it very well could be. So Don Roby has a very direct foothold in the Memphis market because of his interest in Duke Records. Also, interestingly enough, I want to point out, my song, Johnny Ace's first hit on Duke, is one of the records that Elvis had in his collection that he gave to Scotty shortly before the 68. Yep. So we know he owned this record and heard it.
Yeah, and what a, like, I know for a fact Gurdeep has heard this. Like, this is great, like, doo-wop, very haunting production. This is fantastic stuff. So this is Johnny Ace and the Beale Streeters. Who were the Beale Streeters?
So the Beale Streeters they were kind of like the Yardbirds of Memphis blues. Like, the Brits always talk about how the Yardbirds had all these famous people that came through it. Well, nobody compares to the Beale Streeters. The Beale Streeters at different times had B.B. King, Junior Parker, Bobby Blue Bland, Roscoe Gordon, Johnny Ace, Earl Palmer. It's just like it's a long list of like legendary musicians.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a fantastic recording. I've heard this before, and I love this. So, and I just wanted to comment, since we passed She's Dynamite, like I did want to mention, like I think it's worth mentioning, like, the importance of kind of boogie woogie on prototypical rock and roll. Like, you can already hear that in She's Dynamite, and obviously boogie woogie was a whole genre and wave unto itself, following Louis Jordan and some of that, that would carry into not only the, Chuck Berry end of things, for rock and roll, but also it would funnel down through the country side of things to where you would end up, you would eventually end up with your, like, Jerry Lee Lewis's.
Yeah, absolutely. And country was both in, like, all of this music exists in conversation with everything else that was going on at the time. And that's one of the things that's really interesting to discover as you sort of put these in chronological order in your mind. You're like, this is influenced by this, or this person was kind of taken from this. And like another one of the songs that we have right after She's Dynamite, Easy, is clearly a riff on the hit song, the country hit song of that year, Midnight by Red Foley.
Midnight, I've spent another lonely day thinking of you. Midnight, tomorrow is on its way, empty and blue. I am so lonely at midnight for you.
It's a blues version of it, and it's fantastic, and it's instrumental, but it's very typical of the kind of thing that Sam started putting out when he decided he needed to have his own label, that the whole business with working for other people wasn't really sustainable for him.
Right, right. And what's kind of interesting too is easy to me, like you sent it over and I don't think I had heard this before, but immediately like the sort of stepping up and down sort of blues structure, the melody, I was like, wait a minute. This is also kind of like Ivory Joe Hunter's I Almost Lost My Mind too.
Totally.
When I lost my baby, I almost lost my mind. When I lost my baby, I almost lost my mind.
But I love the production on this, you know, this very highly distorted sound. It just cuts through the air and just catches your attention. This is an incredible recording.
It's so atmospheric, and it's such a testament to what Sam was trying to do. He was trying to make records that captured the electricity of seeing these musicians just playing for themselves.
Yeah.
And this is a great one. Yeah.
Yeah, this was Sun 180.
Yeah, very early Sun. And so, like, one of the things that has often been pointed out is my friend Steve Kelly. He's always telling me about when Dewey is first introducing Elvis on the radio. They ask him what high school he goes to, and he says Hume's. And Steve likes to point out, well, it's not just that they want to point out that he's white, which actually I think it is, but it was that Sun was to that point basically an R&B label, right? And so it was a way of pointing out that, hey, white guys can do R&B too, you know?
So speaking of Don Roby and
yes,
and Big Mama Thornton and Hound Dog, one that you put on the list. And also speaking of WDIA, because he was a DJ for it, we're talking about Rufus Thomas and one of his iconic recordings from this period, the rewrite / answer song to Hound Dog, Bearcat.
You know what you said about me, don't you, woman? Well, you ain't nothing but a bearcat. Been scratching at my door. You ain't nothing but a bearcat. Been scratching at my door. You can purr, pretty kitty, but I ain't gonna rub you no more. You said you was a long hair, but I can see through that. You said you was a long hair.
Yes. So if you guys, I'm sure most of you have heard this bit of history, but the reason Sam started Sun Records is because he was getting sued too often doing masters for other people. And he thought that, hey, having your own record label would be a way to put an end to that. But he was sadly mistaken because he had this idea of writing an answer song to Hound Dog. And apparently Sam wrote the lyrics for this. And he came up with Bearcat, and he brought Rufus Thomas in the studio to do it because he'd been recording some stuff with Rufus. He thought he had exactly the right kind of comic timing and personality to sell this record, and boy, was he ever right. And Rufus allegedly asked him, what's a bearcat? And he's like, Rufus, you don't know what a bearcat is? And so he says, it's just a mean old woman, you know? So it's kind of funny that, you know, on the EAP Society, we've talked about how Hound Dog is kind of a pastiche of black culture,
right?
Through the lens of a couple of Jewish kids who were into black music. And it turns out Bearcat is exactly the same thing. It's just by a different guy. It's, you know, it's Sam giving his pastiche of it. And I tell you, though, just like with Big Mama, Rufus transforms it into something real and something immediate and something that is just a heck of a lot of fun. I love this record.
You know, and one thing that we were kind of talking about when you sent this playlist over to me, and I was just listening through again, and obviously I've heard this before, but I was just like really intently like giving this a real listen for, I don't know what for, but like it just hit me. I was like, I wonder, and it's a shame that we don't have like the outtakes for Elvis's version of Hound Dog, because there are moments in this where I'm like, I wonder if in the transition from what Elvis did on the TV shows and live, you know, with that sort of bluesy ending and stuff, if they, in the transition from that to what we end up with on the master, which is wildly different, if there wasn't a discussion that maybe had between Elvis and Scotty and Bill and DJ about what Rufus had done on Bearcat with Sam, you know, and because the bass line especially is very similar, you know, than what Bill Black did. Yeah. So similar to what is played here on Bearcat. And a lot of the electric guitar stuff, it's not similar in terms of notes played, but like there's just a vibe to it that's very similar to what Scotty does.
Yeah, Joe Hill Lewis plays the guitar on this, does a hell of a job. And he has a way of playing a solo that evokes an animal in a weird way. And Scotty's does the same thing. You know?
Get with it now. Get it, get it, get it, get it. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never gonna rap it, and you ain't no friend of
Now, one of the things that I want to point out about this is Ronald Smith, who is a friend of Elvis's, who's talked a lot about going down to Beale Street with Elvis to see B.B. King and some of the other acts that were performing around then. He remembers that, like in this time period, sort of 50 to 52, that two of his favorite performers in Memphis were B.B. King and Rufus Thomas. So I can almost guarantee you he knew Bearcat, and we know that he knew Rufus because he likely was introduced to the song Tiger Man through Rufus Thomas as well.
Right.
But look, to get back to the lawsuit thing.
I mean, obviously, we literally have a photo of Elvis and Rufus Thomas together. So
Exactly. So to get back to the lawsuit thing, when this came out, Roby did not waste any time suing Sam. So his ploy to stop the lawsuits by starting his own label failed decisively here. Roby obviously won in court because it is so drawn from Hound Dog. And I think the settlement...
This is in the 50s, long before like the copyright lawsuits had, like, the courts had later in like the 80s or 90s or something finally settled that like parody technically falls under fair use.
Yes.
When it comments on, you know, the original, you know, topic or recording or things like that. But this was like untested ground. Like, it was no surprise that he lost that lawsuit.
So this was the first big hit out of Sun by Rufus. Well, actually, just the first big hit out of Sun, and it wound up costing Sam money because he got sued. And, you know, Don Roby was sort of like, he was establishing his territory. Like, he saw Memphis as part of his territory because he owned Duke. And Sam and Don Roby would go back and forth in court a few times. Like, when Junior Parker left to go record at Duke, he was still under contract to Sun, and Sam sued to try to get him back. And like, he won that suit, but Don Roby never paid, and Junior never came back to Sun. So it was like the R&B era of Sun was especially litigious because you had all these indie labels that were fighting over territory and fighting over artists and suing each other back and forth. So even if you had hit records, it was kind of difficult to keep your head above water financially because of the sort of shark-infested waters of the indie record scene of that era.
Right. So then obviously a little guy by the name of Elvis Presley comes along.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right with you.
But everyone knows that part of the story. What happens after Elvis Presley leaves Sun Records, or basically just hits like dynamite?
So Elvis comes in, takes off like a rocket ship, and Sam, starts promoting him, starts having records, really starts working himself to the bone to keep up with the demand from distributors to press enough copies of Elvis.
Mm-hmm.
Like they used to say, like one of the deadliest things that an indie label could have was a big hit, because the distributors would order all these copies, which you had to provide up front, and they would go as long as they could without paying you in hopes that your label would go under and they'd never have to pay you.
Right.
And so Sam hits with Elvis, and almost immediately it starts drawing all of these other white guys who had been interested in the blues and R&B and had maybe been blending it into their own style. It draws them out of the woodwork like a magnet, So you get Johnny Cash, who is also in Memphis, who comes and starts recording stuff like Get Rhythm, You've got Jerry Lee Lewis driving up from New Orleans. And the first guy on the scene after Elvis was a little guy from Jackson, Tennessee, named Carl Perkins, who is maybe the most dyed-in-the-wool rockabilly of all the rockabillys, with the emphasis decidedly on Billy.
Well, that must be my gal. You don't look like that. Well, that must be my gal. You don't look like that. I know my baby, she's so round and fat. Well, gone, 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 gone. Well, gone, gone, gone. Well, gone, gone, gone. And gone, gone, gone down the line.
Which it was funny. I was reading, Sam, in Peter Guralnick's biography, talks about how Sam really hated the term rockabilly. That he felt that it sort of had been coined by, big city Billboard magazine type writers, sort of diminishing, rock and roll as an art form, and sort of, kind of downplaying, its power and impact by just saying, it's just kind of these hillbillies. But it turns out to be a very apt description of it.
Yeah, because these guys, they were basically hillbillies, right? No, and we don't mean that in the pejorative sense, but
right.
The industry at the time did. Like, they thought, these guys are just a bunch of hicks. They don't know anything, but God, they're selling records, And so what happens, basically, Elvis's success at Sun is the single most transformative event in Memphis music since the arrival of W.C. Handy. Because almost overnight, what had mostly been a black music market suddenly has all of these white kids getting really popular, right? Mm. And, we're going through the rock and roll movement here. And especially like directly after Elvis, the effect was so pronounced that you had guys who had been struggling country artists in Memphis, like Charlie Feathers, like Eddie Bond, like Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio, who overnight become rockabilly artists to try to jump on the Elvis train.
Oh, yeah. Bandwagon.
And it was, yeah. And it's like Elvis, in the matter of a year or so, transformed the Memphis music scene, at least through the record labels, into his own image,
Yeah, that's the thing, is that everyone and not just, obviously Memphis was the big thing because people wanted to go where Elvis had been, but it happens all across the country too. All of a sudden, within a couple years, like the national labels start scrambling to get their own Elvis. That's how they end up, signing acts, like Buddy Holly or Eddie Cochran or Gene Vincent, or if they can't find one of those guys who are genuinely from the South, you have like a Pat Boone who just sort of does it's like, well, we have this guy on staff. We'll just have him cut some of these blues songs and we'll just go with that, but it's all like reshaping the entire thing in the image of Elvis Presley.
Exactly. And this was not warmly received by a lot of the black artists who'd recorded at Sun beforehand, understandably so, because Sam, because he had this new form of what seemed to everybody to be a new form of music that was very lucrative and that there weren't a lot of indie labels competing for at the moment that he started it, moved toward that because it was a way to escape all these lawsuits that had been plaguing him when he was trying to do R&B.
Right.
But what happened is, like, a lot of the black artists just felt like they were hung out to dry because all of a sudden they didn't have a place to record. They didn't have a place to be heard. And so Rufus Thomas spoke about this a lot, and he was always very clear to make people understand he did not blame Elvis for this. He blamed Sam Phillips for not continuing to record the black artists.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, that's one of my, if I have a major criticism of Sam Phillips, it's primarily that. It's that he had an opportunity to give a platform to new young artists, because you actually start going through, like, you find, like, who are the artists on Sun after Elvis, and if you take out the big names that, like, obviously became major national hits, your Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl, I'll give you Carl Perkins because he does have Blue Suede Shoes and a few others, and Johnny Cash, but you're looking at Jumpin' Gene Simmons, Tommy Blake, a
lot of nobodies,
a lot of Ray Smith. It's just people, Billy Riley's another one. Like, it's, not to discredit any of these guys as entertainers, but these are like second or third rung rockabilly acts, by comparison. And it's like you couldn't carve out the time for, and so, like, the perfect example is Rudy Richardson on Sun Records. He puts out Fool's Hall of Fame, which is a credible Elvis-like recording, far more, honestly, like an Elvis Presley recording than basically what most of the white guys were doing on Sun Records trying to copy Elvis.
Most of the copycats didn't get it as close as
Rudy Richardson. And he goes nowhere with it and disappears from history after this recording, and the reason why we know about it, and why it sticks in our mind as Elvis fans is because we know that Elvis performed it live in some shows, That's, but Sam just doesn't do anything with Rudy,
Can I ever make you see the change you made in me? Just give me a chance to tell you I was wrong. Boom, boom, boom. Yes, baby, say that you'll forgive me. And in this misery, I'll keep on begging till you come back to me. Don't leave me here in shame in the Fool's Hall of Fame.
Another great example is Billy the Kid Emerson, who Sam did record.
We did an episode on.
Yeah, he did continue to record Billy the Kid Emerson, and Billy made some great cuts with him, man. His version of Red Hot is 10 times the record that Billy Lee Riley's is, in my personal opinion.
My gal is red hot.
Your gal ain't do this squat.
That's him. My gal is red hot.
Your gal ain't do this squat.
She ain't got a lot of money, but love it, she's really got a lot. My gal is red hot.
Your gal ain't do this squat.
Yes, she is. My gal is red hot.
Your gal ain't do this squat.
She ain't got a lot of money, but love it, she's really got a lot.
My gal is red hot. Your gal ain't doodless. Yeah! My gal is red hot. Your gal ain't doodless. Well, she ain't got no money, but man, she's really got a lot. Well, I got a gal, 6 feet 4, sleeping in the kitchen with her feet out the door, but my gal is red hot. Your gal ain't doodless. Yeah! My gal is red hot. Your gal ain't doodless. Well, she ain't got no money, but man, she's really got a lot.
And he also did the first version of When It Rains, It Really Pours.
Right.
And Elvis was a fan and apparently a friend of Billy the Kid Emerson. But his records didn't get the kind of promotion that a Jerry Lee Lewis or Johnny Cash would.
And to be fair, even some of the white artists that Sam took under his wing and signed, felt like they weren't getting priority either. Like Roy Orbison famously talked a number of times that he didn't feel like Sam understood how to use him at all. Charlie Rich, he didn't get utilized at all either at Sun, because he showed up at Sun, didn't have a single record put out on the Sun label when he was recording initially for Sam. They just never landed on anything. It's not until Sam starts up his next label, Philips International, that Charlie starts to have some stuff put out and has a few minor hits. But it's not even until Charlie leaves like the Sam Phillips world that he starts to seriously have hits.
Yeah, exactly. And Sam would say until the day that he died that the two artists he felt like he never did enough with were Howlin' Wolf and Charlie Rich.
Yeah.
And he most regretted that he was not able to do more with Charlie Rich. And if you listen to this song here, Who Will the Next Fool Be? It is a brilliant record. Like, records are rarely this good by anybody.
Yeah.
And Charlie's clearly evoking both Ray Charles and Elvis at different parts in this, but he's also forming his own identity. And like, this is Who Will the Next Will Be, classic Memphis song. It's been done in great versions by Jerry Lee Lewis, by Bobby Blue Bland, but like nobody's bested Charlie's original.
And I'd like to be the one to tell him so. 'Cause after all is said and done, you won't be satisfied with anyone. So after you get rid of me, who will the next be?
And you know what I like about this too is that like it's got that little bit. I mean, because obviously this is coming out post Elvis. This is post this is post Elvis getting back out of the army. But like this is there's Nashville style backing vocals on this and piano work. It's a little more lush, a little more sophisticated. It's a little more pop. In a way that Charlie Rich will really hit on in that sort of country paladin feel in the 70s when he finally like really starts to have some big smashes. But the roots of it are kind of here on something like Who Will the Next Fool Be? It's just not really being utilized well by Sam Phillips,
Yeah, I think if there's anybody who is as clearly following the model with the appropriate influences that Elvis sort of carved the path for, of blending black music and white music, it's got to be Charlie Rich, man. The guy was just conversing in it. It flowed out of him like effortlessly,
So Sam, he sort of winds down his like involvement though at like the actual Sun in Memphis. He sort of starts turning things over to Jack Clement and gets like very self-interested in the Nashville studio with Philips International, that label, to the point that eventually he just sells off Sun altogether to Shelby Singleton. But in the meanwhile, there continue to be these other independent labels in Memphis that are springing up, and a couple that we've talked about before on TCBcast.
Yeah, so basically the success that Sam had with selling Elvis to Sun, and then coming up with Carl Perkins, who hit, and then coming up with Johnny Cash, who hit, and then Jerry Lee, was that it started a gold rush for indie labels being founded in and around Memphis, right? And so, like, the next several songs we're going to talk about are from studios that were specifically started, inspired by the success that Sam had with Elvis, and some of the records and musicians that would emerge from them. So, Fernwood was originally started, I think, by Jack Clement. And around 58, 59, when Elvis went into the Army, his band, Scotty Moore and Bill Black, were looking for things to do now that they weren't playing with Elvis anymore. And Scotty wound up buying into Fernwood and producing a lot of records there. And the particular record that we've got here is This Time by Thomas Wayne. Thomas Wayne is a singer who is the younger brother of Johnny Cash's guitar player, Luther Perkins. His full name was Thomas Wayne Perkins. And he had a big hit with a song called Tragedy, also recorded the first version of The Girl Next Door that Elvis would do on Elvis's back. And all of his records were produced by Scotty Moore. And this particular one was written by a young songwriter and guitarist that Scotty had hired to work at Fernwood with him, named Chips Moman.
This time we're really breaking up. This time we said way too much. This time's for all times. How about this time? This time there'll be no good night kiss. This time is forever.
And this one should be familiar to anyone who actually has picked up this Memphis box set and has listened to, on that 69 disc, the medley off the cuff, where Elvis is singing a little bit of I Can't Stop Loving You and It's My Way. But in the middle of that, he throws in a couple, one serious line and then one kind of jokey version of the next line. But of This Time, we actually have a little bit of Elvis singing this.
I think I forgot to wear my coat. That's just my way of loving. This time we're really breaking. I know I forgot to wear my coat. I don't.
Yeah, a nice reference to, a nice way for Elvis to let Chips know, hey, man, I know who you are. I know what you've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a cool recording.
Yeah, and so while Scotty was doing Fernwood, Bill decided he was going to put together a band, a Bill Black combo. And he was finding musicians for it. And when he was putting together his band, he took another young guitarist that Scotty had employed for sessions at Fernwood named Reggie Young. And Reggie is the guy playing guitar on this next record that was a big hit for Bill called Smokey Part 2. He makes the rhythm guitar sound by apparently slapping a pencil against the strings of the guitar. So Reggie innovating even then in 59, 60 when this was going on.
This ended up being actually a really big hit for him. This was number 1 on the Rhythm and Blues chart, number 17 on the pop chart. So Bill Black actually had like a top 20 pop hit, like sans Elvis, without his involvement at all.
Yes, and Bill was very proud of this, and I'm told that as soon as Elvis was back in Graceland, he proudly went over to Graceland to show Elvis his hit record and give him a copy. He wanted to say, hey, man, I could do it by myself,
Yeah. And what's cool, too, is that, you've got Reggie on guitar, but, the Bill Black's combo, like, the lineup obviously changed over the years.
Yes.
But I was reading that at various times, for brief stints, like, Chips Moman ended up as part of the combo. Tommy Cogbill ended up as a member of the combo. So it was a lot of Memphis area type, people who were connected in with the Memphis music scene, like, and the other band members, I was reading like some of the founding type members, Joe Louis Hall, Martin Wallace, and Jerry Arnold. Jerry Arnold will actually pop up on the next song. And Gurdeep and I, way back, I think year 1, did an episode on what like Scotty and Bill kind of did after Elvis. And we talked a little bit about the Bill Black's combos. It was nice that you picked one here because it's been a while since we've really talked about the Bill Black combo. But this is a great recording.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about these recordings, this little independent interregnum but between major labels in Memphis, is that you've got Elvis's band working with a lot of these young guys who grew up listening to Elvis and Dewey Phillips on the radio, and sort of being turned on to R&B by guys like Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And now they're wanting to get into the scene themselves, and they will wind up becoming really important figures in the Memphis music scene going forward.
So, John, tell me about Stax.
All right. So let's back up a little bit with Chip's moment. So Chips was playing sessions and writing songs for Scotty, but what he really wanted to do was produce records. And he didn't feel like he was going to get that opportunity at Fernwood. And there's actually a story that he tells, this one biographer. He says that Chips had actually called Sam Phillips to tell him that he wanted to be a record producer and was wondering if he could give him lessons. And Sam basically laughed at him and hung up and told him that record producers were born, not taught. So you were either going to do it or you weren't,
That's amazing.
Well, yeah. So Chips hears about this guy named Jim Stewart who started a record company basically in his garage a little bit outside of Memphis. And he's wanted to do a country record label, right? And he goes out there to talk to Jim Stewart and basically gets a handshake agreement that he'll be a record producer and help him make a studio and everything, because he was also into engineering and stuff like that. And for a quarter of the business. And so Chips is the one who scouted and found the old Capitol Theater and turned the Capitol Theater into what would become Stax Recording Studios.
So named for the last names of Stewart and his sister, Estelle Axton. Yeah, so yes. ST for Stewart, AX for Axton. And she was financially invested in the label.
Exactly. And so over at what would become Stax, but it was at this time Satellite Records, Chips gets his first significant experience producing records. And one of the interesting quirks of history is, while Sun started out to be an R&B label and basically became a rockabilly label that was mostly populated by white artists, Stax started out to be a country label and became an R&B label that was mostly at least fronted by black artists, And a big part of that was Chip's moment, because that's what he was interested in. That's the kind of artist that he was wanted to record. And so the first couple of songs we have from Stax here are A Fool in Love by the Velatones and 'Cause I Love You by Rufus Thomas once again and his lovely daughter Carla. Fantastic song. So these are both examples of early Chips Moman productions at Stax. Chips was very instrumental in sort of defining the Stax sound and recruiting some of the musicians who would wind up playing at the studio.
I'm just a fool in love with you. You said you love me, said you'd be true. I'm just a fool, a fool in love with you. A fool in love. Love was a game by your own rule. I'm just another one of your fools. I'm just a fool in love with you. A fool in love.
So Veltones, this came out on, Stax had a label that was called Volt at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one that not only did Chips produce this, he co-wrote this with Jerry Arnold, who was the drummer of the Bill Black combo.
Yeah.
And so isn't this just another perfect example of the Memphis blending of black and white music in a single recording? And Stax became kind of well known for having mixed groups or bands on their lineup,
which is actually it is a persistent feature of a lot of the early Stax artists, and it would become endemic to their DNA. because, like, they set up in a neighborhood around Macklemore Avenue, which was at the time it was an African American neighborhood, but it was also like if you go down the street from Stax just a couple of blocks, you'll hit Elvis's old Assembly of God Church. Mm-hmm. You turn one direction, you'll hit the East Trig where Reverend Herbert Brewster had his church, and then around another corner you'll see where Aretha Franklin was born. So like it was a neighborhood that was sort of in the heart of the working class Memphis, and the way that they sort of developed their sound was they just used whoever was handy. And sometimes these people would be like other musicians from the Bill Black combo. Sometimes, like in the case of Rufus and Carla, they would be people who went to school with David Porter and Carla Thomas,
Yeah.
Like the saxophone part on that is played by Booker T. Jones when he was just 14 years old.
He's a kid.
Yeah, and it's great. It's fantastic. You'd never know he was just 14. I mean, Carla herself was a teenager at that time.
Let me tell you when I'm hurting, deep down inside. Baby, won't you by my side? 'Cause I love you. I love you. 'Cause I love you. I love you. 'Cause I love you. 'Cause I love you. 'Cause I love you. Yes, I love you. 'Cause I love you. And I'll never let you go.
So you get white musicians and black musicians working under the same roof just because it kind of happened that way, and they were the best guys available. And Stax, to its credit, followed that model.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Liz. I had heard Fool in Love before. I can't remember if I had heard 'Cause I Love You before, but I really, really enjoyed it. Aside from after you sent me the playlist, then I went and watched the recent 2024 Stax documentary, Soulsville, USA, which I highly recommend. I watched all four I binged it in a single day. It was amazing.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic series, and they even like spotlight, this recording as one of the, big primary early hits. Unfortunately, they kind of cut Chip's moment out of the story of, Stax's early days.
Yes, they do. It's interesting that, as was the case at Sun, Rufus is the first guy to have a big hit for Stax too.
Right.
He was sort of the label starter, just call Rufus, man. He'll get you a hit. So, what happened was, and the reason that Chips was left out of the story was, as I mentioned, Chips had this handshake deal with Jim Stewart, who owned the label, and he was supposed to get a quarter of the business. And when Stax got noticed by Atlantic Records and started making some serious money with Atlantic distribution, Chips went to Jim and he's like, "Hey, can I start being paid for my quarter of the business now?" And according to Chips, Jim basically said, "Hey, we don't have a contract, so I'm not going to honor a handshake deal," basically, Right. So that's what caused the falling out with Chips and Stax.
And just to be clear, there was a lawsuit, and Chips got a settlement out of that lawsuit, which he then turned around and invested his money elsewhere, which we'll talk about where that money went. But
yes,
so there was definitely like it's one of those side stories, a subplot to the story of Stax, which is otherwise this really uplifting story of this studio and label, being born out of and becoming this mainstay of the black community and black culture in Memphis,
right.
And having that also blend on the back end of, you have two white owners and you have white band members involved, and there is a lot of, mixing and things like that, so it's I can understand why that part was left out of the documentary, but there's definitely there's nuance in that story as well, to this early sort of subplot to that.
Yes. And but by the time of These Arms of Mine here, you've got a fully integrated band with and actually this is not your typical lineup of Booker T and the MGs backing up Otis on this, but it is a mixture of Johnny Jenkins and his band and Steve Cropper and a few other musicians that were in the studio at the time. Steve is actually playing piano on this. But what's interesting to me
I just want to say, you just dropped the name of the song and then just said Otis. We're talking about the Otis Redding and his These Arms of Mine, which is an incredible recording.
These arms of mine, they are lonely, lonely and fielding blue. These arms of mine, they are yearning from wanting you.
Oh, it's a fantastic recording. And I'll give you another bizarre Elvis connection to this, is Otis had first recorded for a label in Georgia that was called Confederate Records and was owned by a guy named Bobby Smith, who would later go on to be the first guy to record Jimmy Ellis or Orion as well.
Pretty words by the earful keep telling you lies, and I know you believe them by the look in your eyes. Dance by dance, I can tell that I'm losing you, and the closer he gets, the closer you want him to.
If you want to hear more about that, go listen to TCBcast After Dark, patreon.com/TCBcast.
Bizarre thing, but like for this particular thing, Otis came to Memphis as the valet for Johnny Jenkins and his band, which were being recorded at Stax. And Johnny Jenkins, they recorded their thing, and Stewart and Steve Cropper were not all that impressed. And Otis had been bugging Al Jackson Jr., the Booker T and the MG's drummer. He's like, hey, man, you need to let me sing a song. You guys need to let me sing a song, right? And so Al turns to Steve Cropper. He's like, Steve, will you listen to this guy to get him off my back, you know? And they set up, and the first song they do is These Arms of Mine. And Steve Cropper, he talks in that documentary about how the hair on his arms just stood on its end because he knew it was great, you know? And what's so fascinating about Stax going forward, though, is that you have all of these kids from Memphis who sort of were awakened to R&B by the rock and roll movement and by Dewey Phillips. And it's almost like the Elvis generation that had kind of, at the time, seemed like it was taken from the black community. Like it was the white kids paying back, right? But joining the sort of slipstream of Memphis music and making it a fully integrated music, really for the first time.
These arms of mine, they are wanting to hold you, and if you will let them hold you, oh, how grateful I will be.
We jump ahead a little bit in the story, like not time-wise, like the next song on this is literally just 1962, which is like basically the same time as These Arms of Mine. But
Right.
we have to almost like jump across like state lines.
Yes. Okay. So here's one of the interesting things about this. Like I said, there were lots of area record companies that started because of the success that Sam had had with Elvis. And one of those was a label in a little town called Muscle Shoals, Alabama, that was right next door to Florence, where Sam was from, where W.C. Handy was from, and where the guy who owned this next studio called Fame, Rick Hall, was from. Sam Phillips was Rick Hall's hero. He wanted to be just like Sam. So he was a disc jockey. He started a record label called Fame. and started to record local talent, local R&B guys, and built a band kind of like with Stax out of kids from the neighborhood that were just teenagers at the time. And this next record by Jimmy Hughes is called Steal Away. Great soul song. See if you recognize some of the names of the musicians on this track. On drums, we got Jerry Kerrigan. On bass, we got Norbert Putnam. On piano, we have David Briggs. And then there's also a guitarist that's named, is it Peanut Adams, I think?
I think Terry Thompson.
Oh, Terry Thompson is on this one. That's right. Yeah. And so these guys are the first Muscle Shoals rhythm section.
I've got to see you somehow, not tomorrow, right now. I know it's late, whoa, I can't wait, so come on and steal away, please steal away.
Muscle Shoals kind of serves as a musical outpost for Memphis. It's got deep roots. Like, this region had given us already Sam Phillips and W.C. Handy. And now musicians from Memphis would start working a circuit of studios that included Fame and Muscle Shoals.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, like, we're sort of having to take this sidebar and jump like almost 150 miles as the crow flies across basically 2 state lines. But because, as you said, there's so many connections, and then it becomes so consequential to Memphis music, especially when, as if you're, looking at this Memphis box set, a lot of what Elvis records in Memphis ends up being with these musicians, these guys from Muscle Shoals, these local young guys. Turns out to be very consequential to all of this.
Absolutely it does. And these guys would later go on to become Elvis's band in the studio in the 70s, basically. But yeah, here they're recording this song with Jimmy Hughes, which is a fantastic song. It charts. They find out they can have hits there. And as usually happens with these indie labels, once they start having hits, they get noticed by the majors. And they start kind of doing what Sam used to do. They make records. They basically loan out their band in studio to a major label who wants to come in and cut a record there,
Right.
And one of the records, the next one, called Everybody by Tommy Rowe, was done by a producer from RCA named Felton Jarvis, who heard these great records that were coming out of Muscle Shoals and wanted to take his artist, Tommy Rowe, down there to cut something good, So he goes down there, and he likes it so much that he convinces the band to follow him to Nashville and become session players.
And this is, of course, like, obviously we know Felton, later in the 60s would become Elvis's producer, but like, he had already indicated that he was a massive Elvis fan. He had produced at a Tommy Rowe session, carved out time for an Elvis impersonator that he nicknamed Vince Everett. Like, this is a big Elvis guy, already as a fan. And when you start to put these puzzle pieces together between Muscle Shoals and Fame and back in Memphis, you start to see that Elvis's musical trajectory of the 70s and late 60s starts to make a lot of sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
it feels more inevitable more than anything else.
Yeah, you see exactly how the road would lead him where he went. and in the late 60s and 70s, definitely.
Yeah.
And so what happens after Felton steals Rick Hall's band from him is that he's got to put together another band. And so this is when
steals away like the Jimmy Hughes song.
Yeah, just like the Jimmy Hughes song. He stole those guys away from him. He's got to put together another band, and he starts staffing his sessions in the interim with these guys from Memphis. So among them are Chips Moman, Tommy Cogbill, Al Jackson Jr. from Stax, a lot of the guys that you would be familiar with. And he supplements them with other kids that he would find in Muscle Shoals that would eventually become his next band, which are guys like Jimmy Johnson and Roger Hawkins and David Hood, the guys that would eventually become known as the Swampers. But he also, Rick is a very smart guy, and he understood that, the key to making good records was having good songs. So he also developed a real powerful stable of songwriters with guys like Dan Penn, Spooner Oldham, Chips, I think, even wrote some songs that he did down there.
Oh yeah.
Another group that he first recorded for Rick Hall and Muscle Shoals before they would work their way up to Memphis was the backing group of Jeannie Green and the Halliday Sisters. They started out down there as well. So anyway, during this time period, Chips is kind of jumping between studios, getting work that he can as a session guitarist since stuff has fallen out at Stax, and he still wants to be a record producer. And he uses some of the settlement money and some money from a business partner named Don Cruz to open a little storefront record studio that he calls American. And he said that he picked the name American because he wanted it to be the first one when you looked up recording studios in the phone book. And he starts to cut records there. But he has this vision where he wants to find the best musicians in this sort of in the recording scene and bring them all to American so that he have the best band and he could bring songwriters and arrangers and have just the premium setup at American. Well, that's a few years off yet, but the seed is planted. He starts recording songs by guys like the Gentrys, which is a local rock and roll band, has some hits with it, but does it really as a side hustle while he's working as a session musician.
Right.
And one of the sessions that Chips was really a huge player in was the moment that Aretha got her soul back, right? So Aretha Franklin was the daughter of a preacher who at one time was a prominent preacher in Memphis. She was born in Memphis, Tennessee. His name was C.L. Franklin. And she was raised in the church singing. People immediately recognized that this girl has got all kinds of talent. And she was signed by Columbia Records in New York, discovered by John Hammond. And they put out a series of records on her that were less than she was capable of. They're good records. They're just poppy. They're not what we know Aretha for. Go ahead.
Not big smashes.
No, she didn't have any hits. None of them really caught on in the public imagination.
We've played the game of stay away, but it cost more than I can pay. Without you, I can't make my way. I surrender, dear.
So you got this massive talent, and her contract with Columbia ends, and she gets picked up by Atlantic and Jerry Wexler. And Wexler is looking for a way to kind of rebrand Aretha and get out of her what he knows is in there. And first he approaches Stax and offers Aretha's contract to Stax, and they actually weren't interested because they had listened to her records and they're like, I don't hear anything in this. So he winds up taking her down to Fame, Muscle Shoals. And this was the first time she had been back to the Memphis area. I think she'd lived there when she was 4, you know? Yeah. She goes to Fame, and it is this honky who runs the studio, and all these white guys. And she's like, I don't know what I've gotten into here, but she's brought this song called "I've Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You," and she plays it on the piano, and all these guys immediately know, hey, this girl has got it. And so what they do is they work out an arrangement. I think Spooner Oldham is one who's playing the keyboard at the beginning, but they find it, and she instantly knows, like, this is her. This is who she's supposed to be. And among the musicians playing on this session were Tommy Cogbill playing the bass and Chips Moman playing the guitar on the song where Aretha found her sound. I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You, recorded in Muscle Shoals in 1967.
My friends keep telling me that you ain't no good. Oh, but they don't know that I'd leave you if I could. I guess I'm uptight, and I'm stuck like glue. 'Cause I ain't never loved a man the way that I love you.
That comes out as a single, becomes this massive smash hit, top 10 US, pop chart, #1 rhythm and blues chart. The flip side of that is a Chips Moman, Dan Penn co-write called "Do Right Woman, Do Right Man."
If you wanna do right, home days, woman, you gotta be a do right, whole night man.
That's exactly right. Yeah, another fantastic song. Now, what's interesting about this is that Aretha's husband got into a big fight with Rick Hall because basically Rick Hall did something that kind of pissed off Aretha's husband, and Aretha's husband called him a racist, and that was just not something you called Rick Hall. So they actually had a literal fist fight. And because of this, Aretha's husband would not let her go back to fame to record any more records. So what they did was they wound up bringing the Swampers and Chips and the whole gang up to New York so that they could basically cut sessions like they would at Fame, but in New York. Yeah, and that's like those are the guys that are on all of her defining hits on Respect, Chain of Fools, Think. Like, it's all the core of that Muscle Shoals group.
Just in a New York studio.
In a New York studio.
And just to throw in there, the most famous hit off that being Respect was originally done on Stax by Otis Redding.
Exactly.
What you want, honey, you got it. And what you need, baby, you got it. All I'm asking for a little respect when I come home. Hey, now, hey, hey, hey. Yeah, now, R-E-S-P-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-C-T, take out TCB. Sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me, little respect. Sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me. Ooh, yeah, little respect, just a little bit. I get tired, little bit, keep on trying, just a little bit.
So it's very much a part of the Memphis scene. Like, you've got Memphis musicians on this, you've got Memphis songwriters. Like, it is, it's like Aretha basically laid out the template for what Elvis would do from Elvis in Memphis, right? Mm-hmm. You go back home and find your sound, and Chips was instrumental in that. But because of the fallout and because of the band being taken to New York and being offered all these other opportunities, Rick Hall gets his second band stolen away from him, right? And to back up just a little bit, I said that that Chips's vision had always been to kind of collect the best guys that he knew on the recording session scene into one studio. And two of the guys that were very important to this sound were two guys that were working at Sam Phillips Recorders for Stan Kessler. And that was Bobby Wood, piano player, and Gene Chrisman, the drummer. And Bobby Wood was somebody that Chips really wanted in his band. And it took a long time for him to convince him to jump over, because he was having some success with Stan at Sam Phillips Recorders. Stan had been producing him, trying to make him kind of a teen idol type. And he did a series of records that sold fairly well, including what is on this playlist, the very first version, If I'm a Fool for Loving You.
If I'm a fool for loving you, that's just what I want to be. They're saying I am just your clown, and any fool could see that you're just having fun, and you're not in love with me.
What ended Bobby's career as a teen idol is that he was in a car wreck and he lost an eye and had to wear an eye patch.
Yep.
And so he decided to just focus on being a session musician. And eventually Chips won out, you know. And so Chips takes Reggie and he takes Bobby Emmons and Mike Leach from High Records. And he takes Bobby Wood and Gene Chrisman from Sam Phillips Recorders. And he takes Tommy Cogbill and the Halliday Sisters and Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham from Fame. And he's finally got his crew, right? And so he's got the band that he wants. He knows he's ready to roll. He's ready to make the studio that he's always dreamed of. And he actually invests in upgrades to the studio to make it a little bit more like what they had at Fame. He really liked the echo chambers that they had at Fame. He had it redesigned. They were rebuilding American. And while they were rebuilding American, they borrowed High Records, where Bill Black had cut his hits with the Bill Black combo. And they recorded a song that Chips had written with Dan Penn called The Dark End of the Street. And it's by a guy named James Carr, who was a Memphis soul singer. It is a masterpiece of Southern soul. And is also, I believe, the very first recording where we hear the entire American gang on one record. And even though it was not recorded at American, it sort of gives you an idea of things that would be coming.
At the dark end of the street, that's where we always meet, hiding in shadows where we don't belong, living in darkness to hide our wrong. You and me at the dark end of the street.
Yeah, that's it exactly. You know, it basically, like, when you listen to this, you are getting effectively the same sound as Elvis's 1969 sessions. And the most, evident part about this, like the fact that, like, I mean, so like this comes out on Gold Wax Records. And this is another one of those other Memphis labels. This Gold Wax was founded by Quentin Clunch, who had been a session musician at Sun and had previously started up High Records.
Yes.
And Quentin is one of the producers on this, but it effectively is like it's Chips' sound, like with the band and stuff. And
it's a Chips moment production.
The fact that this sounds the way it does and is like the Chips moment sound, the reason why we can say that almost definitively is that The Dark End of the Street was re-recorded almost identically with the exact same band in 1969 at the same time Elvis was recording for Chips, but with a different artist.
Still away to the dark end of the street. They're gonna find us. They're gonna find us. They're gonna
walking off the street, you and me.
Oh yeah, with Roy Hamilton. And Roy does a great version of the song too. And I tell you, I just want to comment on Quentin Claunch a little bit because he's one of these really interesting figures in the Memphis story. He was, like Jim Stewart, a country fiddle player and had a country band. But Quentin thought that nobody in Memphis really knew how to do country music, you know? That like it just didn't jive.
Having listened to a lot of the country music records that came out on Sound Records, I think he was right.
Yeah. And so he's like, music in Memphis is not really country. It's this weird like blend of country and R&B and all this stuff. So like he just went with what was popular, and like he loved R&B music, and he found James Carr, who was a very talented singer, and he believed so much in James Carr. Yeah. But the problems that they had when he'd been recording James Carr for Goldwax was that he just couldn't find great songs for him. He had a hard time with that. And so when he heard Chips doing Dark Into the Street, he kept after Chips. He's like, "You got to let me cut this. You've got to cut this with James Carr. Like I'll give you whatever you want. Like just let me have a cut on this with James Carr." And thank God that he did, because this is one of the good recording. It's one of the masterpieces of Southern soul music. It's just fantastic. So anyway, this is the first taste of what was to come. And Chips got his band, and he got his studio, and he also got the attention of the major labels. And he had seen some of the problems that both Rick and Jim Stewart were having by being reliant on Atlantic Records. So he decided he was not going to rely on just one major record label. He would do the work for hire, but he was always going to have more than one label sending him artists so that his entire financial future didn't depend on one company, you know? Right. And the next song on the playlist was one of the artists that Atlantic brought down. It is Sweet Inspiration by the Sweet Inspirations. Yes, those Sweet Inspirations.
Now, this is Gurdeep and I did a review of this album 2 years ago, May 2022, episode 218. We talked about this incredible recording from the Sweet Inspirations.
Oh, yeah. This is a Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham composition, so it's got a little bit of Muscle Shoals DNA in it as well. And they apparently wrote this like on the spot for the Sweets. And Chips just knew it was a great song. As soon as he heard it, he's like, "Yeah, this is gonna cook," you know. And so it's just really interesting to see that the Sweet Inspirations actually recorded it at American Studio before Elvis did, and they would later record at Stax while Elvis was recording there, I think.
Yeah. So there's definitely connections, and we know that Elvis was familiar with the song. Why do we know that, John?
Because he sang it live August the 20th of 1970?
Yeah, and it's great. It's fun.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, you can tell he's having a lot of fun with it, too.
Oh, yeah. I gotta have a sweet inspiration. I need you here on my girl life every hour of the day. Without your sweet inspiration, the lonely hours of the night just don't go my way. Forgetting love needs sweet inspiration.
Now, the next track, this was kind of news to me. I'm ashamed that after all that we did covering the American Sound Sessions, talking about this song, somehow this one hadn't come up. This version of this song did not come up.
Yeah. So a little history on this group. The Box Tops were a Memphis rock band. And what's really funny is, like, after they put in American Studios, you know, Chips was determined to have hit records. And he had some decent hits. But then one day, this rock band, the Box Tops, was coming in. And Chips famously did not really like rock and roll. He said he liked country and he liked rhythm and blues, but he didn't really like rock and roll. And so he let Dan Penn be a producer, and they come up with a little song called The Letter that was the first #1 to come out of American.
Give me a ticket for an aeroplane. Ain't got time to take a fast train. Lonely days are gone, I'm a-going home. My baby just wrote me a letter. I don't care how much money I gotta spend. Got to get back to my baby again. Lonely days are gone, I'm a-going home. My baby just wrote me a letter.
And that really pissed Chips off. But, you know, it made him competitive. So Chips produced Cry Like a Baby, and they had another #1 with him. So it was fine, you know. But this particular song is off of Box Top's album called Nonstop. And the song is I'm Moving On. Now, if you think this sounds a lot like the arrangement on From Elvis in Memphis, that's because it is the arrangement from Elvis in Memphis.
I told you, baby, from time to time, but you just wouldn't listen to pay me no mind. Now I'm moving on. I'm rolling on. Well, you've broken your vows, so it's all over now, so I'm moving on. But someday, baby, when you had your play, you're gonna want your daddy, but your daddy will say, keep moving on. You stayed away too long. Well, I'm through with you, but too bad you're blue. Keep moving on. Move on, baby, move on.
The thing that Chips would do when he was recording the Box Tops was, even though they were a band, he would only bring in the singer, and the Memphis boys would play the backing parts,
which is wild.
Right, and so then the band would have to learn these when they went out on the road, and they interviewed some of the band members in the Robin Jones book, and they were like, we didn't mind. Those guys could play circles around us. You know? And so, one of the things that they would do at American, because they were working with so many artists, is they would develop these arrangements that they liked. And if it didn't hit with one artist, they would try it again with another artist. So they had done this arrangement of I'm Moving On with the Box Tops. It's a fine version, but it wasn't a big hit. And so when Elvis came to record, somebody decided this would be a really good thing to try with Elvis too. And one of the things that I was pointing out to you when I was first showing you this track a couple of days ago was that if you compare this to Elvis's version, you see a lot of what Elvis brought to the production of these records. Elvis was famous for rehearsing his band, or jamming with the band for hours before they would sit down and record. And if you listen to the difference between this version of I'm Moving On and the From Elvis in Memphis version with the exact same players, the From Elvis in Memphis version is so much more confident and loose and spontaneous. And like these guys were just born to play these parts because Elvis had kind of warmed them up to that point to be ready to unleash all this energy. You know?
Yeah. You know, this is where it was a partnership between Elvis and Chips, you know, as producers. You know, this was not... for as much as Chips was the producer on these sessions, like Elvis still took a very active role in, you know, these songs that he recorded. And the same thing goes for, like, yes, people will play back to back. Like, okay, yeah, Chips had cut Suspicious Minds with Mark James, and it's close to the same version of it, but there's a feel to it that's different with Elvis.
Exactly.
You know, even if the notes are near identical, the vibe is different.
We can't go on together with suspicious minds, and we can't build our dreams because suspicious minds.
Oh, let our love survive. Oh, dry the tears from your eyes. Let's don't let a good thing die. When, honey, you know I have never lied to you. We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out.
Yeah, the vibe is different. And the box top it's a good cut, but like there's something so liberated about Elvis's version.
Yeah.
It just clicks in a way this one doesn't quite. Plus, Elvis's vocal is just masterful.
Yes. So, what happens with American after Elvis's sessions?
Yeah, so Elvis came there at a very unique time. It was right after the assassination of Dr. King, and they'd actually had...
I will say, we will touch on if and when we do the larger series on, because that is a hugely monumental thing that impacted the Memphis music scene in astounding ways. And it's something that is an emotional beat that we need to give proper context to.
We've got to flesh it out because
it
really is. Yeah. It's like the start of the third act, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what happens is like that assassination and the violence that followed it, and really the suspicion of the authorities and stuff that followed it, it gave a hesitance to black artists to coming to Memphis to record. Black artists who are not from Memphis. Let me clarify that.
Yeah.
And American had actually had a session booked with Aretha Franklin, and Lord, I would love to have heard what would have come out of that. But after the assassination, she didn't feel like it was appropriate for her to go to Memphis to record. And so, like, Elvis comes in at a moment that is both the apex of American studio when they are at the top of their game, but it's also like the top of the hill, and the other side is the downward slope, you know? And so stuff gets harder after Elvis. Like they're not booked as frequently, but Chips like continues to make really good records. And eventually, like I think by 72, American was basically done. They all moved to Nashville.
Because a lot of what happens, like even some of the other artists who were like mainstays, like BJ Thomas, just kind of got tired of working with Chips, and like BJ Thomas took Glenn Spreen with him over to Atlanta, Georgia, to work on his albums, and Chips ended up firing Glenn because there was sort of this unspoken rule, or maybe openly stated rule, of like if you do any work for any other studio, then you're out. And so Glenn ironically gets hired on by Felton Jarvis to work on Elvis's stuff, which is kind of neat, arranging the strings and stuff on Elvis recordings. But things just sort of like slowly fall apart because it's still like, reading through Robin Jones's Memphis Boys book, American is run kind of sloppily, and a little unprofessional in a lot of ways. It's very loosey-goosey. Sure. It's... like the musicians aren't being paid for overtime. They're getting scale pay. It's not particularly lucrative. Like they could have gone to New York or even Nashville, gotten a lot more money, but they were just really passionate about, the music. But they all burned themselves out, I think, pretty badly, including Chips. It's one of those things where it's like there's less work, there's no big hits, the sessions start to dry up, the guys are burnt out. At one point in 71, Stan Kessler shows up and joins American as an engineer and a producer. And some of the last stuff at American, interestingly, has a lot of Elvis connections, in a weird way. It's still sort of, even though the studio and the label are starting, with AGP are starting to really wind down in 71, 72, and eventually it goes away by the, mid to end of 72, some of those last sessions really are and some of the last artists that work on there really are guiding lights for Elvis in the 70s, weirdly, of some of the directions that Elvis is going to go in. One of the songs that gets cut at American, Danny O'Keefe comes down, this folk artist, and cuts Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues at American, which Elvis cuts at Stax in 1973.
Everybody's gone away. I believe this time they're gonna stay. There's not a soul I know around. Everybody's leaving town.
Some caught a freight, some caught a plane. Find the sunshine, leave the rain. They said this town will waste your time. I guess the right is wasting mine. Some gotta win, some gotta lose. Good time, Charlie's got the blues.
And speaking of that, you've got Tony Joe White as well.
Tony Joe White, yeah. So Tony Joe White comes in and cuts I've Got a Thing About You, Baby, which Elvis also cuts in 1973 at Stax.
I've got something to tell you, I think that you ought to know. I've had my eyes on you, babe, since a long time ago. And now I finally got the nerve, and I'm gonna make my move. Now don't you try to turn me off, cause it's gonna be hard to do.
I got a thing about you, baby, ain't nothing I can do. I got a thing about you, baby, a thing about loving you.
But the one that I really wanted to touch on, because I thought it was an interesting overlap with Garrett and I's country music series, that I brought it up there, and it really hadn't clicked with me that this had also been recorded at American Sound, because it ended up being released on Warner Brothers. This wasn't an AGP release. It was for another label. It ended up being on Warner Brothers, but Arthur Alexander comes down in mid-1971 and cuts his self-titled album on, down there, which includes the original version of Burning Love.
But your kisses left me higher, like the sweet song of a choir, and you light my morning sky with burning love. Ooh-wee, I feel my temperature rising, yeah. Help me, I'm flaming, it must be 109.
Burning, 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 and nothing can cool me. Yeah. I just might turn to smoke, but I feel fine. 'Cause your kisses lift me higher, like the sweet song of a choir, and you light my morning sky, burning love.
Which releases in January 1972, and it doesn't really go anywhere for Arthur, but obviously Elvis gets his hands on it. It becomes a massive, massive, iconic, late, great Elvis rock and roll song. But as we talked about in the country series, you have a quote-unquote country songwriter in Dennis Lind. You have a quote-unquote rhythm and blues or blues artist in Arthur Alexander, who also had a lot of country DNA and had cut a lot of country songs throughout his entire
100%.
his entire career, doing what is ostensibly a rock song with a soul arrangement, but being played by the Memphis boys at American Sound. So yeah, it's so many different connections layering over itself.
Yeah. And one of the things that I find almost poignant about this is Chips was once a musician at Fame. The very first artist that had a hit for Rick Hall at Fame was Arthur Alexander. That's how they got put on the map. And here he's one of the last guys that Chips would record at American.
And so, yeah, I mean, American winds down, and Stax, meanwhile, is still going real strong in the Memphis music scene. You know, and obviously, like, there's not as much that we've included on this playlist from the late 60s into the early 70s, except for this one recording. But obviously, there's a lot of great music coming out of Stax, and they continue to grow as this mainstay of the Memphis music scene. But they also sort of start to come apart in the 70s, but not.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'll just give a little context to people. So basically, like, Stax had signed a distribution deal with Atlantic back in the early 60s to distribute their records, and Jim Stewart had not really read over the contract, and it also gave the masters of the songs to Atlantic after the distribution deal. And so in 1969, Stax found itself with basically no back catalog. And they did this, the guy who was the producer there named Al Bell did this thing called the Soul Explosion, where he wanted to record 25 albums at once to basically relaunch Stax, and worked the musicians to death. You got some real moments of brilliance to come out of this, like Isaac Hayes' first album, which Isaac would become a pillar of the Memphis music scene in the 70s. I think this might have been when they started recording the Staple Singers, who were also, really great. Mm-hmm. And Stax, like, Al Bell really tried. He saw that the major labels were kind of eating up the independents, and that if Stax was going to survive, it was going to have to become a major. And he really did his damnedest to make it a major label. And the label kind of capsized in the process. It was just like biting off more than they could chew, because they got into some bad loan deals, and then there's a phony indictment that was cooked up against him. And so what's interesting is by the time Elvis recorded at Stax in July of 73, it was not really used as a studio for Stax label anymore.
No.
They were mostly recording either in Muscle Shoals at the studio that was started by the second band that left Rick Hall, called Muscle Shoals Sound Studio, and in a studio in Jackson, Mississippi called Malico. And so Elvis was one of the last major artists to really record inside the original Stax studio.
Yeah, which is such a shame, but it's nice that we have this, with Elvis's Stax recordings. And what's so incredible, the track that you have picked next, is that, I think for a long time, Elvis at Stax was not really recognized for the importance of what it was, because the albums themselves were not presented particularly well. The three albums that came out of those sessions, with Promised Land and Raised on Rock and Good Times, Elvis fans, I don't think, really quite knew what to make of them, because a lot of Elvis's fans were really hard and fast about, like, Elvis had sort of abandoned rock and roll. And, if it wasn't rock and roll, then it didn't matter. If it wasn't fitting their particular idea of what Elvis should be doing during that part in his career. And that also at the same time, he's sort of kind of getting to be a nostalgia act while he's on tour. But at the same time, he is cutting new material, and he's obviously, like, at the beginning of 73 having this massive television special with The Law from Hawaii. It's just a weird period for Elvis Presley, and obviously because he has his divorce, he sells off the back catalog to RCA and starts competing with his own product, which is a big problem as well. And so the Stax material kind of gets buried for a long time, a number of decades, and it's really honestly not until 2013 with the Elvis at Stax box set that there starts to be a retrospective look back at this as as part of not just like Elvis's career and sort of contextualizing it there, but also as part of the Stax canon. That, like, yes, are a lot of the band members Elvis's band from the road? Sure. But there are also, on a lot of tracks, some members of there are Stax players in there.
Yeah, you've got some of the guys from Booker T and the MGs. You've got some of the Memphis Horns guys. You got some of the guys that played at American. You've got some of the guys from the Muscle Shoals original band that Felton stole. So, like, it's very much part of the Memphis music like this big river of Memphis music history, right?
Right.
That's collecting in stacks for Elvis's sessions. And yeah, like the records that Elvis cut there belong as much to Stax as they do Elvis, right? In terms of history.
I know you're a lonely woman, and I love you. But someone else is waiting, and he owns you. If he should ever wake up, be sure your story is straight up. If you talk in your sleep, don't mention my name. And if you walk in your sleep, forget where you came.
And what was most remarkable is the one that you found next it's a cover of one of the songs that Elvis did at Stax. Was explicitly written for Elvis Presley by Red West, who lived in Memphis and is part of the Memphis music scene as well, over a number of various, like Red has his own thing. But it comes from Little Milton, who puts out this record, this cover of an Elvis Presley song on Stax. And
has a hit with it.
In 1975, If You Talk in Your Sleep, Little Milton. Wow, what a recording.
Walking every night here in the shadow, so afraid that sometime he may follow. There's always a chance he'll find us, so I don't need to remind you. If you talk in your sleep, don't mention my name. I said if you walk in your sleep, forget where you came.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Little Milton told the story about hearing Elvis's version of that and thinking like that he could really do something with it, you know, and he did. Like he did a great cut. And Little Milton, like interestingly enough, like this shows you what a singular community Memphis was. Little Milton was also one of the guys that recorded for Sun in the 50s.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so he'd been around, like he knew of Elvis. And he had a hit with one of Elvis's songs. Like Elvis was putting back into the community, right?
Maybe unintentionally, but it totally worked, you know. And it reaffirms the fact that what Elvis cut at Stax should be considered part of the Stax canon, you know, and part of the Memphis music canon, you know. And so that brings us to, like, obviously Stax goes through a really rocky period, as you talked about. Like, there's financial issues and things like that. The building itself, like, basically gets abandoned and turns into a ruins and eventually is torn down, you know, where Elvis recorded and where all these great iconic artists recorded. Like, Elvis comes in so late in the process.
By the time that Elvis was ready to record Today, like, recording at Stax was no longer an option because the label had folded.
Yeah.
Like, that's how quickly it kind of collapsed after Elvis recorded there.
And, like, how many other labels were there? Because American was down.
American was gone. Sun was gone. I mean, Philips Recording still existed, but it kind of, like, it hadn't done anything in a long time. High Records was still going strong because in the early 70s, it was taken over by Willie Mitchell, who was a local band leader, visionary record producer. And he sort of starts producing a run of soul records by people like Al Green and Otis Clay and Ann Peebles that are just burning up the charts in the 70s. But even that, like, starts to kind of peter out in terms of chart success by like 75, 76.
You know, and one of the things that kind of stuck out in the Stax documentary, you know, Soulsville, USA, was sort of the discussion that they had about, you know, the fact that the city of Memphis didn't support its music industry as strongly as people really desired. And that's another thing that came up reading through Robin Jones's Memphis Boys book, is that Chip's Moman, part of the reason why he left and went and took everything up and moved to Atlanta was because he didn't feel like the city of Memphis cared. You know, one thing that gets talked about is that the band basically felt like they didn't exist because with a lot of American stuff, because they were cutting material for other labels, it didn't matter how many hits they had for Dusty Springfield and Neil Diamond and B.J. Thomas and Elvis Presley and Aretha Franklin, or, you know, whoever, you know, it wasn't recognized, you know, as part of Memphis, you know, and it wasn't putting Memphis's name on the map. And so one of the things that sort of comes up in the Stax documentary is this idea that Memphis itself, the economic and political leaders of Memphis, sort of disdain the music industry.
Yeah, there's always been this rigid social strata in Memphis, and there's this group of elites that are mostly moneyed white people who have, like I said, tried imperfectly through the entire history to sort of impose their vision of society on Memphis unsuccessfully. They always disdained the music industry because this was elevating black people. It was elevating poor white people, that what they considered white trash, and the type of people that they kind of looked down their noses at. So, you know, there were times throughout history where the relationship was better and when it was worse, depending on who exactly the mayor was, usually.
Right.
But the Memphis music industry never got any kind of civic support and was really not recognized as being central to the city's identity until after it was all gone.
Yeah, which is such a shame.
It's
which is
very sad.
Which is where by the time 1976 comes around and Elvis, you know, Felton has this idea of like, okay, we can't drag him out to go to anywhere else. He's certainly not going to record in Nashville. Let's just go literally inside of his house. Like it's sort of an anomaly for like Memphis, you know, in terms of like it's in a way like literally the most connected you could be, but also the most isolated and disconnected from the Memphis music scene as it could be.
Exactly.
You know, you have like one of the singular most famous Memphis musicians recording literally in his own house in Memphis, in one of the most iconic houses in America, but let alone Memphis. And it's just like the material, like you've got Mark James's Moody Blue in there. And obviously Mark had been, you know, writing for Chips and, you know, had recorded with Chips and stuff like that. But like, it feels very different. You know, I was talking with you and I was like, you know, a lot of this feels almost like it's Nashville imposing on Memphis in a way, but not with, I guess not in a negative connotation, because really it's Elvis embracing this material. Like, he's the one who wants to record this stuff, but you have stuff straight out of Nashville, like Bitter They Are, Harder They Fall, which is the Gatlins, you know, She Thinks I Still Care and Never Again and Love Coming Down and He'll Have to Go and Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. Even The Last Farewell, you know, is you know, with Roger Whittaker, even though that's UK, it was embraced by country radio.
I have no fear of death, it brings no sorrow. But how bitter will be this last farewell. For you are beautiful. I have loved you dear, more dearly than the spoken word can tell. For you are beautiful. I have loved you dear, more dearly than the spoken word can tell.
Sure, yeah, but like you said, you still have songs by Mark James. You have Pledging My Love, which is a very important Memphis song because it was recorded by Johnny Ace back in the 50s originally.
Just promise me, darling, your love in return. Hey, this heart and this hold here forever.
So, yeah, there are traces of the Memphis scene here, but it's very much part of the larger Elvis sound, and it's not as direct as influences you'd obviously see at American or even at Stax.
Right. But at the same time, like David Briggs is still there on piano, and
exactly,
so on. And so when we were looking at this set, and you and I were having a heck of a time trying to come up with like where do we close this playlist and close this sort of like bookend this discussion about the Memphis music scene, with it sort of effectively dying off, in the 70s, around the time, that Elvis is recording in his final sessions, at his house. Where do we end at? And you had weirdly the most perfect poll.
Yeah, I was looking through. I was like, man, we got to find something that kind of connects to the Jungle Room sessions here some way, right? And so what I found was, and this is really interesting because it also echoes how the first time that recording companies had left Memphis, the artists had to go outside of Memphis to be heard again.
Right.
And we have a 1977 post-Stax recording of Isaac Hayes and Dionne Warwick doing a live version of the Morris Albert song Feelings.
Which, famously, like Elvis wanted to record or considered recording.
It was recorded and it was erased. There is a sliver of a hope that a version is still out there somewhere. So maybe we'll hear it.
The
one
X-rated
day.
version of Hurt exists. So you never know. Feelings, I think, it's one of those songs that I think a lot of people joke about because, in the Morris Albert original, like, it's very 70s.
Oh, it's so super 70s.
And I think there's a lot of people that look at what Elvis put out from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee, and how that was treated in terms of overdubs and things like that. And a lot of people have really struggled to even contextualize. A lot of Elvis fans and writers have really struggled to contextualize the 76 material. And I think even more so, like people really struggle with It's Easy for You. And I don't know how you feel about It's Easy for You. I particularly love that song, but it's a show tune, really.
Yeah, it's definitely got a little bit of schmaltz in it, a little bit of Hollywood glitz or Broadway glitz and glamour, let's say.
Yeah, West End or Broadway theatricality, which was always part of Elvis Presley,
sure.
to a degree.
And what's interesting about that, now that you say, is like, Elvis and Isaac Hayes are kind of spiritually connected on some plane. Because if there's one guy that tried to dress as loud or tried to outdo Elvis in terms of dressing loud and having blinged out Cadillacs and wearing the big sunglasses, it's Isaac Hayes. It's like there's some kind of cosmic tailor making these guys jumpsuits where they're trying to, or stage wardrobe where they're trying to outdo each other. They're connected in a very spiritual way, I think.
I had a wife and I had children. I threw them all away. And now you tell me, you dare to tell me I should go back to them. What do you think? What on earth do you think I should say?
Absolutely. But that's the thing. I think that there is this tendency for a lot of fans to look at the theatricality of Elvis, but if he goes a little too pop at the end, there's a lot of pushback. And the same thing goes with Feelings. I think there's a lot of people who go, I wish that we didn't, I'm glad that we don't have that, because he probably, would have overdone it, like he did so much of the other 76 stuff. And so I love that you found this recording of Feelings that was off this live album with Dionne Warwick, who's, in a number of ways connected back around as well.
Oh, yeah. Not only did she make an album at American, but I believe the Sweet Inspiration started with her.
Yeah, they did. They were related to her. So
yeah.
So I thought this was a nice way to kind of go out. And like, all the people who would have criticized Elvis as like being uncool and out of touch and stuff for doing a song like Feelings. And yeah, maybe Elvis was unhappy with the particular performance that they turned out in that session. At the same time, like, this song is not so bad and so worthy of mockery that, like, Isaac Hayes can't get away with this.
Hell, Isaac made it cool. And I think if anybody else could have probably made it cool, it would have been Elvis.
Yeah.
For all my life, I'll feel it. I wish I'd never met you. You'll never come again.
That, I think, wraps most of our main discussion for the kind of Cliff Notes version of what you and I had been wanting to do on the sort of a Memphis music history. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to go into and a lot more stories. We didn't even talk about gospel music. We didn't talk about Reverend W. Herbert Brewster. There's so much more to the story. This is just like, we've really centered this around just these songs that we've touched upon and gotten a lot of ground out of this. So
as long as this is the Cliff Notes version, there's so much more.
It really is. So if you like this, please let us know if you want to hear more and want to hear us talk more about the Memphis music history, because we have a lot more that we would like to dig into. And John, thank you so much for bringing your expertise. Thank you for putting together this playlist. This has been so rewarding for me because, as I said at the top of the episode, like, treat me like a Memphis moron, because in a lot of ways I still am. There was so much going through this where I was just like, wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I didn't put two and two together for this thing, and
it's one of those things. That's why I'm so obsessed with this story, is like, people can see Elvis as such a singular figure, and they see like Stax and all these other things that were going on in Memphis as being separate, but like, he was part of that milieu,
Yes.
Like, this was Elvis's community, and he was both influenced by it and influenced it in return.
Absolutely. So, that makes our episode for this week. And folks, if you want to hear more from John, cannot recommend more highly EAP Society. That's youtube.com/EAP Society. That you co-host with Jamie Kelly, who's also a good friend of the show, and just recorded with Gurdeep a bonus episode for our Patreon backers. Did an episode of TCBcast Now. Now, obviously, TCBcast Now is typically our pop culture general discussion where we talk about Marvel movies and comic books and video games and things like that. And Jamie's got a lot of stuff to say about that stuff because he's a geek as well. But oh boy, there's a lot of Elvis discussion in that episode. You get Jamie and Gurdeep together, and there's a lot of Elvis discussion too. So I always love when we get to team up on projects like this, and I'm really looking forward to if we get to do more and expound upon this. And really develop it, and I really do hope that folks have enjoyed it, because I certainly have, and I cannot thank you enough, John.
Oh man, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and nerd out with you about Memphis music. It's my favorite topic. I can talk about it all day long, as you guys see, and I have thoroughly enjoyed this, Justin. Thank you so much.
Yes. All right, so that is it for the week. So, folks, if you enjoyed all of this, you can support us over at patreon.com/TCBcast. Get access to all that extra bonus content, but also just help chip in and help support the show and keep it sustainable and keep it going. If you want to send us any feedback, tcbcast@gmail.com, or, of course, we are on various social media, primarily Facebook, but we really appreciate everyone who sends in comments and feedback and emails and things like that. Love hearing from you guys, and look forward to doing so much more. So with that, I believe it's a hot time in Florida.
A rainy night in Georgia.
You've been listening to the TCBcast, an unofficial Elvis fan podcast.
Someone must have stomped on his head with those blue suede shoes.
Thank you and good night.